concerned that if they acknowledge these people. So this also gets into a technical issue about what a refugee is. And I don't know if you heard the comment, but it's exactly right. A refugee is someone who fears persecution in their home country. And you know, that's the technical legal definition under the Refugee Convention, which the Chinese themselves have signed. But the Chinese claim that their motives are not fleeing persecution. Their motives for coming to China are increasingly economic, which I think is just simply a false argument in terms of the Refugee Convention. So the Chinese are also engaged in a little bit of sleight of hand in terms of what a refugee actually is. And they're claiming that because the refugees have economic motives for coming, they're not actually refugees. But I just don't think that anyone believes that that argument is consistent with the Refugee Convention as written.
Are the Chinese actively trying to remove the refugees and return them to North Korea, or are they pretty just hands-off about the whole issue?
That issue goes up and down with how publicly the refugee movement has tried to, the outside refugee movement has tried to spotlight the refugee problem. And here I think is one point where Jung Sung and I actually have subtle disagreements on some of this, though I think we're fairly close. But one point he made that is, I really agree with, applies also to the Chinese. Highly visible efforts within China to spotlight the refugee problem, the Chinese crack down. And so, you know, for example, there have been efforts to stage protests at, you know, the Japanese embassy or the Chinese embassy, or have, you know, North Korean refugees storm into the embassies and seek refuge. Every time that's happened, often organized by outsiders, the Chinese immediately clamp down on the refugee population and send the signal. But that said, I think the tendency over the last 2 or 3 years, unfortunately, has been towards clamping down on the refugees. And we know that there's cooperation between the North Korean security apparatus and the Chinese. So the Chinese will hand refugees back to the North Korean authorities, and then they're subsequently put into labor camps and in some cases tortured and executed. And that, by the way, is also a violation of the Refugee Convention, which is if the person's a refugee, you're not supposed to turn them back to their country of origin because they fear persecution there. So the trend in the last couple of years has been tightening down on the community in China, no question.
So it's true. So most of North Korean refugees left North Korea primarily for economic reasons. But once they are in China, then they have fear of being prosecuted when they return to North Korea.
Right. And the reason, and let me just say one other thing, let me interrupt this briefly. The reason that they fear persecution, and the reason we believe that anyone, or I personally believe anyone who leaves North Korea should be treated as a refugee, is because the North Korean law actually prohibits you from leaving North Korea. And so if you're legally prohibited from leaving North Korea, then you're naturally going to fear persecution on return because you violated the law of leaving the country.
But most times when people leave, it is for more economic reasons, because they don't necessarily, people there don't necessarily have a perspective of being prosecuted the way that we see them, or persecuted the way we see them.
Yeah, so but, until the mid-90s, before the famine, so there are not many refugees. There are some North Korean defectors. They are primarily political reasons, and they're primarily from elite. But after the famine, North Koreans primarily leaving the country because there is food shortages, that kind of thing. But when they leave, they know it will have political consequences. So they have legitimate fear of returning to North Korea. And the South Korean government policy has been receiving any North Korean refugees, not from China, but from third country. Because if the South Korean government receives North Korean refugees from China, then it will cause a diplomatic problem with the Chinese government. So South Korean government has been avoiding it. But once refugees, they successfully land in a third country, then South Korean government have seen that. So if the number of refugees will end up increasing over time, so now it's over 10,000. And one thing, when North Korean Human Rights Act was enacted in the United States, one of the clauses, I think, was helping North Korean refugees. But now I think there are some criticism that the American government was not active in receiving North Korean refugees, while South Korean government, even without the North Korean Human Rights Act, actually has been receiving all the applicants.
Yeah.
So you said that like open demonstrations against the government or in China and things like that, they cause like a clamping down of the policing. Would you say that like hidden organizations like LiNK is also causing a clampdown?
That's a tough question. I saw the movie, and I was a little nervous about it when I watched it, frankly. I mean, I didn't say this publicly at the time, I just kept my mouth shut. But I was a little bit worried about the publicity that they were throwing on this issue, because I can't believe that someone in China isn't looking at that. But on the other hand, there's no other way to get people out, because of the point that Jung Sung made, is that the South Koreans, I think, are rightly cautious about taking refugees directly from China. Unless they can get a forged passport, or there's some other way where they can surreptitiously get out of the country. And so if that's the case, if you just look at a map, it's a long way from North Korea to a third country, right? You either have to go to Mongolia, which is the closest northern route, or you have to cross the entire country to Southeast Asia. And there's no way that's going to happen without organized support. So I think the question is, I mean, LiNK, I think, is using publicity about the fate of the refugees to raise resources to make their underground railroad work. Other groups are doing the same thing. I mean, the churches, for example, in South Korea are very actively involved in this, and they have to raise money to do it. But there is a balance between raising money for this purpose and alerting the Chinese to the fact that the Underground Railroad exists. So, but I don't think you can completely get around that dilemma. I still support them. I think they're doing good. Yeah.
I remember during the fall there was a like the nuclear testing, or like the nuclear bombing or something. I was in Korea at the time because I was studying abroad. And I just remember seeing it all like in Korean, so I don't know what they call it in English, but like with that, I'm sure that like the hostility between like North Korea and South Korea was very heightened. Like, and then after that, like we didn't really hear much about it. So do you know what the state of like those relations are now?
Oh, I mean, I spend all my nights waking up and sort of thinking about this question. Let me just go back and say a few other things about the Obama administration and why all of us are somewhat disappointed in the North Koreans, those who hoped we would be able to engage them. You know, Obama, when he ran for office, he said, we're willing to negotiate with our enemies. And he didn't mean that Obama was going to go to Pyongyang, but that someone like a Steve Bosworth, who was our designated representative, would go to Pyongyang and so forth and have these kind of conversations about how to get things back on track. And the North Koreans responded to the Obama administration in an incredibly hostile way. I mean, they tested missiles in March, and then the UN passed sanctions against North Korea following the missile test, and the North Koreans responded in April by testing a nuclear weapon. And then you had the sinking of the Chonan, which was very controversial in South Korea, whether the North Koreans sank it. In fact, I believe they did sink it. And then you had these events in November. So the shelling of North Korean soil. So all of those things have made it extremely difficult to get back to negotiations. And they made the two incidents, the Chonan was controversial, but the shelling of Yongbyon, the North Koreans admitted that they'd done it. And that had a very sharp effect on public opinion in South Korea, made it more hostile towards it. So I think that on the policy front, the United States has taken the position that there has to be some sign from the North Koreans before the US can take the initiative in getting back to the talks. And the nature of that sign is that the North Koreans will make some gesture to the South Koreans. And so the formula looks like it's going to be, and Jung-sung knows about this as well or better than I, is that there be some North-South talks on the nuclear issue first, and then if there's at least some progress on those, then that would provide the basis for restarting the six-party talks. And look, I don't have high hopes for the six-party talks, but I just think we're better off talking than we are not talking. And so, and this administration has been, I think, was kind of burned by the events of 2009, and as a result has not been as forthcoming as you might have thought. And then we're also kind of trapped by our allies because the South Koreans don't want this whole thing to start up again. So that's a kind of stalemate where we are. And I think the reason people are putting a lot of hope on the Carter visit is to see whether Carter can somehow pull a rabbit out of his hat, to get a gesture from the North Koreans that would permit these talks North-South to go forward, and then from those into the six-party talks.
Let me say a little bit about South Korea's attitude toward North Korea after the North Korea's shelling the Yongbyon Island. So understandably, immediately, even after the Cheonan ship sinking, so South Koreans, there are some growing concern about North Korea's attack and possibility of war, but that was not that great. But after the Yongbyon, it was a real threat, a real picture. So South Koreans were shocked, and more the conservative position and the hardline position gained more ground. And the current government, the hardline policy got more support. But on the other hand, there is a problem of confrontation between the North Korea human rights activists who try to balloon the leaflets and the local residents who want to stop it. Because the North Korean regime announced repeatedly they will shoot if shoot the ballooning. So the residents were afraid they would become the target of North Korean attacks. So recently, for hours they struggled, who want to balloon and who want to stop it, and that is a common practice. And there is a gubernatorial election in Gangwon, which borders the North Korea, and traditionally conservative practice, but opposition, the liberal candidate won for the gubernatorial election.
Basically today. I mean,
Yes.
This happened in the last 24 hours.
Yesterday. So that says the Yongbyon effect of building support for the conservative approach has largely faded out, while people prolong this tension make people on the one hand think, in the end, we didn't have this kind of security threat under the liberal government with sunshine policy. So that kind of thing may factor in a little bit, and Lee Myung-bak government, current government may shift a little bit toward the more center. That is some of the observation. Well, we don't know.
Let's just get someone else who wants to come back. Yeah.
Can you